Thank you very much, Hannah. And I hope you can all hear me. And I'm pleased that you offer me the occasion to do it again and keeping my fingers crossed that technology will be on my side. And being the month of May, I thought that my reflections should be situated in the theme of the International Women's Day. And this theme really was stressing the need to accelerate actions to meet our goals in terms of building a feminist future that includes everybody and which future really offers equal rights and power for everybody. But then it was accompanied with a warning about the slow pace at which processes were progressing, and the fact that really at the current pace, if we hope to meet our goal, we should expect to do it in 2158. I think that can be distressing for a number of us 5 generations from here. And so I felt that this whole question about conceptual clarity to sharpen our tools that generate knowledge to inform policy can add to shorten the time and accelerate the action. So I'm indeed grateful for this time again, and also deeply appreciate all who have turned up to listen to me. And the abstract that was floated made it clear that this is a presentation that is based on an existing publication of mine, which is the editorial of Feminist Africa that was published in 2022, Volume 3, Issue 2. It's available online, and I encourage people to do that. But I've also had the occasion to just rethink some of the issues. So let's go to the starting point, which really is how agrarian transformation was seen as a pivotal point for development or underdevelopment, and a number of former colonies that attained independence were hoping to just mimic the whole point about moving from agrarian so-called backward production forms and all that. So the whole question about targeting gender issues came up, a concurrence of factors, but I think that what is critical is the seminal work of Buzzarop, that's the Women in Development Caucus actually hooked on to get policy attention for women, because then they shattered a number of myths. The myths that the male was an economic agent, a main income earner, in particular that he was a benevolent head. But on the other side also was that women were economic agents and were not just there producing supplementary income or altruistic caregivers, and that their economic actions also were targeted. Yeah, so of course, it became necessary then to reconceive development interventions, and women's participation was seen as critical solution to development failures. All this thing about countries that were failing to catch up, and even those that were industrializing also having higher levels of inequality and the persistence of poverty, hunger, nutrition, and a particular area of child welfare. But all these interventions that had women as add-ons did not yield the desired effects. So you had this whole area in development interventions when we said women were misbehaving because they did not behave, their behavior was not consistent with the assumptions that fed the intervention. So a classic case is Gambia's Jali Pasha project, and I encourage people to read that as well. So, there's this whole thing about development assumptions that are fed by existing knowledge. And once development assumptions are disturbed by intervention outcomes, then there's need to go back to the drawing board. So more research to understand why women were rejecting interventions that were supposed to benefit them, or why the outcomes really were far from what they expected, what the expectations were. So there were some policy responses, and people said, well, let's move from adding women on and to broad interventions. Let's target women and bring them areas like high-yielding crop varieties or animal breeds, and then farming practices and methods. Let's also talk about environmental conservation, because then the whole thing about extreme weather patterns and its impact on agriculture and soil health also was coming up in the fall. And then there's a question also of alternative livelihoods, because clearly family farms, peasant farms were also not producing adequate income to support rural households. So people said, well, let's turn attention to productive resources. So productive resources in the area of capital, in the area of technology, in the area of extension services, in the area of land, labor, and markets. And the tensions were around the fact that it's not enough to provide women access to capital. You still have to deal with the fact that they did not have equal access or control over land. They did not have control over their labor, and extension services also that neglected them. So a lot more questions came up, because then the outcomes were mixed. And even women targeted interventions, even if women were reached and were very active, as soon as the intervention project ceased, you had a situation where women really uptake will fall back. So questions were, what do we do about sustainability? And so more research on issues about sustainability. And what were the questions that came up? What were the issues that came up? Because the first is around land. And of course, we are all aware about how land sits in this whole thing about agrarian transformation, because the whole point is to move from traditional agriculture, sometimes labeled as backward because it's labor intensive and depends on nature, to technology intensive agriculture that's more predictable, that's less at the mercy of the weather. But with this also comes competing land use. Land use in terms of even large acquisitions of land for technology-intensive agriculture. But land use also for infrastructure, both soft and hard. So we are talking about roads, we are talking about factories, processing plants, we are talking about schools, we are talking about hospitals, we are talking about energy, we are talking about mechanization and all that. And then there's also the whole question about residential accommodation. So you have new tenure agents beyond, in our own case, in Ghana, where we have customary land, a plural legal system, because we have statutory and we have the customary land, where customary groups are owners of land, and land is owned communally. But then you have other agents that are interested in land, like foreign direct investors, like local elites that need land for residential purposes. You also have the state and the cronies as well. So this brings up a number of things, but then the main issue really is communal ownership and commodification tensions. So how much land women have really depends on how much land is available, the intensity of land markets. So there are issues around size, distance, and tenancy forms. But these are issues that I will provide more details in the discussions as well. So the whole thing is the fact that all these issues were narrowing the customary routes that women use to access land. And note here, one's interest really is in peasant and subsistence agriculture, because peasant and subsistence agriculture cannot take place on privatized lands. It requires customary communal ownership of land to survive. So the second issues that came up also in terms of research what was the fact that if you're talking about alternative livelihoods and diversifications and women's earnings, as their earnings from peasant and subsistence farming reduces, then what avenues were emerging? And these avenues also people research is talking about how agriculture was feminizing in terms of large-scale agriculture, corporate agriculture, providing more and more avenues for women as wage workers. And also the other side also is women's own crops that were being commercialized. So vegetables that can be sold on domestic markets, but also on international markets. And the fact that in most communities, men would migrate to look for non-farm livelihoods, and women also had to take up agricultural tax as well. So traditional tax on family farms or household farms that were male tax, when male leave, women have to take over these as well. And then people talk about women's labor and how women's productive and reproductive labor is getting bled. So what does this mean? Because as workers within rural households, women's work status is not very clear, because they are there as wives, they are there as daughters, but mainly as there as wives. So their tax on household farms, family farms, it's seen more as their marital obligations, and so an extension of their reproductive labor. But then, as increasingly they have to take up wage forms, they have to be involved in market-oriented farming, then it becomes more productive and less reproductive. But what came up also in research really was that women were not a homogeneous group. So depending on their ethnicity, inheritance systems, their class, residential locations, the access to land differs, and then there's the whole case also of age and life cycle. So younger women as daughters, older women as wives, as widows, as divorcees, and all that. So we come to their maternity. How many children do you have? Are they males? Are they females? What age are they? And are women really in marital unions that are monogamous or polygynous? All these things really determine their access to productive resources as well. And within households also were interests. The fact that even though household taxes are gendered, they are gendered, but then also the household survival rests on these rules. So women, in terms of household survival, sits more within what is supposed to be their nurturing roles. And sometimes intervention access is informed by that. So what are their interests in terms of interventions, and how does it conflict with the survival, household survival? How does it sit there? And so there's a whole area of the fact that for women, it's not just taking up interventions, but these interventions also, to what extent does it allow them to, is it a form of, does it represent a form of resistance, and therefore then fall back on the status quo, which is the agenda rules as well. So the initial conclusions were that, well, we need to look at patriarchal norms and values, and the patriarchal norms and values sit at the core of gender roles in production and reproduction, and these are critical in terms of women's access and control to resources. Then So critical for women really is the fact that if they can control their earnings and those earnings can be used to support their gender roles in ways that doesn't conflict with inter household interests and survival, and these are areas that they are ready to make concessions. So then this was calling attention to how, sorry, I think I need to go back a bit. Yeah. This was calling attention to how interventions can be packaged to respond to existing gender norms and values that could allow women to circumvent the gendered constraints around productive resources. And this raises further issues for reflection. First of all, these are the issues really that support the use of alternative lenses for me. And I leave room for us to debate. The whole question about a singular focus. And this has been discussed at length also in other publications that I refer to in that introduction. First of all, that we move away from impact or prediction studies, and therefore it's important to look at the gendered issues beyond time use surveys and women's labor burdens, and to stop focusing on whether women are participating in agricultural interventions. It's important to look at that. But we need lenses that allow us to examine gender-altering potentials of interventions. And by this, really look at what are the gender norms underlying patriarchy, constructions of femininity and masculinity also that support patriarchal agricultural production in rural context, and what alterations assessing agricultural productive resources and women's household provision roles are likely to emerge, and the potential for interventions, whether they are hybrids or seed varieties or breeds, to replace gender norms as well. And also dealing with gender modifiers. And let's say that the whole area of intersectionality has been very critical here as well to deal with some of these things here. Further questions calling for new lenses also really are, what are the gendered assumptions that inform intervention goals? Are they reformative? Are they transformative? And really, what's the source of agricultural provisioning, agricultural feminization? Is it situated in state provisioning? So what are state interventions for agriculture, and how does it lead to feminizing agriculture? What is the position of agriculture in the national economy? And what opportunities does it offer women as outside agriculture? Do we have the lens to allow us to also understand women's agency, especially look out for outliers beyond women who are victims, but women also who are trying to challenge the status quo, issues of female out-migration, tenure making, and all that? And what about masculinization of agriculture? That's also at the other end of feminization of agriculture as well. Which feminine tasks are taking over with the introduction of technology? What about non-farm male employment and wage and unwage labor as well? And what alterations are emerging in female reproductive and productive labor? And we did research about conceptions of women's empowerment, and we noticed very interesting things that are coming in terms of who a woman, an empowered woman, is supposed to be. So the other is dealing with the centrality of female labor in agriculture. The lenses that allow us to focus on the rural political economy and how it integrates women into the global economy. What about markets? Where do women sell their goods? And where is the final consumer located? What about inputs, seeds, chemicals, technology, credit? and AI. We found very interesting research about agricultural digitalization and who is controlling it, and as efforts to reach women as well. And then how do women subsidize international capital markets? The whole thing about subsistence, peasants, smallholder, contract farming as well. How are women situated? Are they seen as workers? What benefits do they derive in terms of the whole life course of their labor as farm workers as well? So this calls for tools also to unpack the commodification of communal land and the absorption of non-capitalist modes of production into as communal land gets more and more commodified as well. Yeah. And finally, what are the discourses that are legitimizing female exclusion from productive resources, especially land? And it would be interesting also, yeah, to look at that as well. So I pick up in terms of some examples of alternative lenses, and some of these discussions come up in other publications. For example, Maduka and Angelo's bundles of power within webs of power, and asking that we shift from just looking at access and control and look at what is lost in terms of access, or what is gained in terms of rights and power to use land or not use land, and what other forms of agents that come have to be dealt with as tenure agents. Then the Shivi's capitalist surplus extraction. This is critical also for looking at non-capitalist forms of production. So peasant agriculture, where does it sit in the entire global political economy, producing cash crops, for example? And then the social reproduction theory that allows the lens to situate women's productive labor within women's reproductive labor within productive activities. So if most agrarian women in Ghana that are in peasant households, subsistence households, are there as wives, then they are not really in the normal sense productive workers. So then they are there performing reproductive roles, and therefore, how does the social reproductive theory allows us to unpack where their work sits as well? So I'd like to end by noting that really the question still remains about alternative lenses that we can bring to our study on agrarian livelihoods interventions, because it's critical that we capture knowledge that can devise transformative strategies to accelerate progress towards egalitarian gender orders. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions and answers.